At 1:30 on March 2, 1945, First Lieutenant Hermann Ernst pushed his P-61 Black Widow through absolute darkness over the German border, tracking an enemy contact he could not see. There was no moon, no horizon, no visual reference of any kind. Only instruments glowing faintly in the cockpit and the quiet, steady voice of the man behind him guiding every move. Ernst was 26 years old and had already spent 8 months flying night combat missions, a type of warfare that stripped away everything pilots were trained to rely on. He had also survived something most men did not, a catastrophic crash that had killed everyone else on board. Behind him sat Lieutenant Edward Kopsel, his radar operator, who carried a nearly identical past. He, too, had walked away from an accident that had taken the lives of his crew. 2 men who should have been dead were now flying together in a machine they had named Borrowed Time. The name was not a joke. It was a statement of fact. Night fighting in 1944 and 1945 followed a brutal and unforgiving logic. During the day, American bombers crossed Germany in massive formations protected by fighters. But when darkness fell, the balance shifted. The Luftwaffe still controlled the night skies. German aircraft slipped across the English Channel, striking airfields, fuel depots, and supply areas, hitting targets that believed themselves safe once the sun went down. The Army Air Forces needed a solution, and they found it in the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, the first American aircraft designed specifically for night combat. It was massive for a fighter, stretching 49 feet in length with a wingspan of 66 feet, and powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines. Fully loaded, it weighed over 13 tons. It carried devastating firepower, 4 20mm cannons mounted in the belly, and in some versions, additional 50 caliber machine guns mounted in a dorsal turret. When the Black Widow found its target, it could destroy it in seconds. But finding the target was the real challenge. The aircraft's nose was filled with the SCR-720 radar system, a 400-pound array capable of detecting enemy aircraft from miles away. The radar operator sat behind the pilot, isolated in his own compartment, watching a circular scope as a green line swept across the screen. When it struck something, a returning echo, it appeared as a small blip. From that blip, the operator calculated range, direction, and relative position. The pilot, meanwhile, saw nothing. Ernst flew entirely on instruments, following Kopsel's instructions with absolute precision. When Kopsel called a turn, Ernst turned. When he called for altitude, Ernst climbed. When he said the target was 500 yards ahead, Ernst armed his weapons and prepared to fire into darkness. Most pilots hated this. They had been trained to rely on sight, instinct, and visual judgment. Night fighting demanded the opposite. It required total trust in another man and the willingness to act without ever seeing the enemy. A hesitation of even a few seconds could mean losing the target entirely, or worse, flying directly into danger. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron had learned these lessons the hard way. Before they ever faced the enemy, they lost crews to mechanical failures, disorientation, and training accidents. The Black Widow was powerful, but it was unforgiving. Mistakes were often fatal. Ernst understood that reality better than most. The crash he had survived before joining the unit was never far from his mind. The memory followed him into every mission, a constant reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Kopsel carried his own version of that memory. Together, they formed a crew built not on optimism or superstition, but on experience, on the knowledge of how close death could be. In a squadron where many crews relied on rituals and lucky charms, Ernst and Kopsel relied on something simpler: trust. They did not question each other. They could not afford to. Their partnership had already proven itself months earlier, during the V-1 flying bomb campaign over the English Channel. On one of their early missions, Kopsel picked up a fast-moving contact. He guided Ernst into position using only radar returns. At first, there was nothing to see, just empty black sky. Then, at the last moment, a faint orange glow appeared ahead, the pulse jet engine of a V-1 missile burning in the darkness. Ernst fired immediately. The 4 20mm cannons tore through the night, and the V-1 exploded in a fireball that illuminated the sky for miles. It was the first confirmed P-61 kill in the European theater, proof that this new kind of warfare could work. But intercepting pilotless bombs was one thing. Hunting human pilots in total darkness was something else entirely. On this night in March 1945, as Ernst flew over the German border, that was exactly what awaited them. Somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of his eyes, an enemy aircraft was moving through the same darkness, guided by its own instruments, its own instincts, and its own intent to kill. Ernst tightened his grip on the controls, listening as Kopsel's voice cut through the silence with the first set of vectors. The hunt had begun. The new base at Maupertus sat on the Cherbourg Peninsula, close enough to the front lines that crews could hear distant artillery rumbling through the night. It was a constant reminder that the war was never far away, even for men who fought it in the sky. Night fighting over France was nothing like hunting V-1 flying bombs over the Channel. The flying bombs followed predictable paths. They did not maneuver, they did not think, and they did not shoot back. German pilots did all three. After D-Day, the Luftwaffe adapted quickly. Daylight operations over France had become suicidal under Allied air superiority, but at night, the balance shifted again. German bombers and intruders slipped through the darkness, attacking supply convoys, bombing forward airfields, and strafing troop columns moving toward the front. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron existed for one purpose: to stop them. Ernst and Kopsel flew their first true combat mission against piloted enemy aircraft in mid-August 1944. A ground-controlled intercept station vectored them toward a contact moving west at 8,000 feet. Kopsel picked it up on radar at 4 miles, a clean, steady return. Ernst adjusted course immediately, trusting the voice behind him more than anything he could not see. The hardest part of night interception was not finding the target, it was identifying it. Regulations were clear. Positive visual identification was required before firing. The skies over France were crowded with Allied aircraft, bombers returning from missions, transport planes carrying supplies, and fighters patrolling sectors. A mistake meant shooting down your own side, and that came with consequences no pilot could afford to face. But at night, shapes blurred into shadows. A twin-engine silhouette could be a German Junkers Ju-88 or a British Mosquito. A single-engine aircraft could be a Focke-Wulf or AP-47. The difference between life and catastrophe often came down to a few seconds of recognition in near-total darkness. Ernst closed the distance. 600 yards. 500. 400. Kopsel called the range calmly, his voice steady despite the tension. Ernst still saw nothing but darkness ahead of him, an empty void where an enemy was supposed to exist. Then, slowly, a shape formed. A faint outline against a slightly lighter horizon. Twin engines. Twin tail. It did not match any Allied aircraft profile. That was enough. Ernst fired a short burst. The 4 20mm cannons roared, their recoil shaking the aircraft. The shells struck the left engine of the target, which erupted into flame almost instantly. The aircraft rolled sharply, trailing fire, and began a steep dive toward the ground. Ernst followed it down, watching until it struck a field in France and exploded. The kill was later confirmed as a Heinkel He-111, likely returning from a harassment raid against Allied positions. It was their first victory against a piloted enemy aircraft. But one victory did not define a career, and the 422nd quickly learned that success in night fighting depended on more than skill. It required opportunity, a target that happened to enter your patrol sector, and equipment that worked at the exact moment you needed it. The P-61 was powerful, but it was also complex. Its twin engines required constant maintenance. Radar systems failed without warning. Hydraulic lines leaked. Electrical systems shorted out in the cold. By the time the squadron relocated to Florennes, Belgium, in September 1944, Ernst had already flown dozens of sorties, most of which ended without contact. Even when they did find targets, mechanical failures often ruined the intercept at the worst possible moment. Other crews faced the same reality. The squadron did score kills, but the pace was slow, almost frustratingly so. German aircraft appeared in small numbers, scattered across a wide front. Finding them felt like searching for a single moving object in an ocean of darkness. Then December came, and everything changed. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes. Nearly 200,000 troops, hundreds of tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft surged forward in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. For the first time in months, the Luftwaffe committed significant air power to support ground operations. Suddenly, the night sky over Belgium was alive again. For the 422nd, it meant opportunity. It also meant pressure. The squadron's operational strength had been reduced by mechanical issues and losses. On some nights, only 4 P-61s were available to cover an entire sector. For aircraft against an enemy desperate to regain momentum, Ernst and Kopsel found themselves flying almost constantly. The winter conditions made everything worse. Snow covered the airfield. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Ground crews drained engine oil at night to prevent it from freezing solid and covered aircraft with tarps to keep ice from forming on critical surfaces. Every takeoff carried risk, and every landing demanded precision from exhausted pilots. But the Germans kept coming. On the night of December 26th, the 422nd launched every aircraft they could get into the air. Ground control reported multiple contacts crossing into Allied airspace. Ernst and Kopsel took off around midnight, climbing through broken cloud layers into a sky filled with radar returns. The scope was crowded. Kopsel filtered through the signals, separating real targets from ground clutter and false echoes. Most contacts were too far away or moving away from their patrol zone. Then he found one. A single aircraft, heading west at 6,000 feet. Ernst turned immediately. The Black Widow accelerated, closing the distance rapidly. At nearly 5 miles per minute, they began to overtake the contact. For miles, 3, 2, the target remained steady, unaware of the aircraft closing in from behind. At around 800 yards, Ernst caught the first visual cue, a faint exhaust flame flickering in the darkness. The German pilot had navigation lights on, likely believing he was safely behind his own lines. It was a fatal mistake. The aircraft resolved into the shape of a Junkers Ju-88, a twin-engine bomber that had been a threat since the early days of the war. Ernst fired. The cannons tore into the bomber, and within seconds it rolled over, trailing fire as it plunged into the cloud layer below. Kopsel tracked the descent on radar and confirmed the explosion on the ground. That same night, other crews from the squadron scored additional victories. 5 German aircraft were destroyed in a single night, more than the unit sometimes achieved in an entire month. For a brief period, everything worked, but it came at a cost. Aircraft were down under constant use. Pilots flew back-to-back missions with little rest. Fatigue built slowly but steadily, and mistakes began to appear. One crew was lost to friendly anti-aircraft fire. Another crashed on landing after a mechanical failure. By mid-January, the German offensive had stalled. Allied forces pushed the Bulge back, and the Luftwaffe began to withdraw its night operations due to fuel shortages and heavy losses. Just as quickly as the targets had appeared, they disappeared. January and February became a return to silence. Long patrols, empty skies, radar scopes filled with nothing but weather and friendly returns. The Germans adapted, flying low to avoid detection or avoiding patrol sectors entirely. Weeks passed without a single intercept. For pilots like Ernst and Kopsel, who had tasted success during the Bulge, the return to hunting nothing was frustrating. They spent hours chasing ghosts, contacts that faded, disappeared, or turned out to be nothing at all. Then March arrived, and with it, change. Intelligence reports began to indicate increased German activity along the Rhine. Reconnaissance flights detected movement at airfields deep inside Germany. Something was building. On the evening of March 1st, Ernst and Kopsel were assigned to patrol over the German border. Ground control reported multiple unidentified contacts in their sector. After 2 months of silence, the sky was alive again. Ernst lifted borrowed time into the night at 2,200 hours, climbing through broken clouds toward their patrol zone. The weather was marginal, but good enough for interception. Beneath the cloud layer, visibility stretched just far enough to matter, if anything ever appeared. Kopsel powered up the radar and began scanning. The green sweep cut across the darkness. Returns flickered, faded, returned again. Some were ground clutter, some were nothing. But somewhere inside that electronic noise, targets were moving. The first hour passed without contact. But both men knew this night would not stay quiet. Ernst settled into a steady racetrack pattern at 7,000 feet, holding position while waiting for ground control to feed him something real. The intercept station, call sign Newtaus, had far more powerful radar than anything mounted on the P-61. From their screens, operators could see aircraft moving across entire sectors, tracking targets from 50 miles away and assigning interceptors where they were needed most. At 23:15, the call finally came. A single aircraft, heading west at 4,000 feet, roughly 20 miles northeast of their position. Ernst turned immediately, banking the Black Widow toward the intercept point as Kopsel locked onto the contact. The chase unfolded slowly at first, then with increasing tension as the range began to close. 8 miles. 6. 4. For 12 minutes. Ernst flew entirely on Kopsel's voice, making small corrections in heading and altitude while staring into complete darkness. Then, just as they were about to close inside engagement range, the contact dropped sharply toward the ground. It vanished. The radar return dissolved into ground clutter as the German pilot dove low enough to blend with terrain reflections. Ernst followed him down, searching, but it was already too late. The target had escaped into the darkness below, using the land itself as cover. They climbed back to altitude and resumed patrol. 15 minutes later, another vector came through. This contact was faster, moving southwest at high speed. Ernst pushed the throttles forward and gave chase, driving the P-61 to its limits. The Black Widow was fast for its size, but this target stayed just out of reach, gradually pulling away until it crossed into another sector. Ground control handed it off, and once again, the chase ended without result. 2 intercepts. No kills. The frustration was familiar. Then the sky lit up. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from below without warning. Allied gunners, jumpy after months of German night attacks, had spotted the silhouette of the Black Widow and reacted instinctively. Orange tracer rounds arced upward, streaking through the darkness toward them. Ernst rolled hard and dove away from the barrage. The aircraft shuddered as fragments of shrapnel rattled against the fuselage. Kopsel quickly assessed the damage. Minor hits, nothing critical, but the flak had forced them off their patrol line and into a gap between sectors. Ernst made a decision. Instead of returning to position, he turned east, toward German-controlled airspace. There would be no friendly fire there. If the Luftwaffe was flying tonight, they would have to pass through this corridor. The gamble paid off. At 1:10 on March 2nd, Newtaus called again. Their radar scopes were now crowded with returns. Multiple contacts near the German border. More activity than they had seen in weeks. Something was happening. Ernst and Kopsel were assigned a single target, heading west at 6,000 feet, 12 miles out. Ernst turned to intercept. Kopsel locked the radar and guided him in. This time, the contact did not run. The range closed steadily. 2 miles. 1 mile. 800 yards. At 500 yards, Ernst finally saw it. A faint glow in the darkness, twin exhaust flames burning against the night. The shape followed a long fuselage with a distinctive twin-tail configuration. Kopsel recognized it instantly. A Messerschmitt Bf-110. A German night fighter. Hunter had become prey. Ernst closed to 400 yards, aligning his gun sight with the center of the enemy aircraft. The Bf-110 flew straight and level, its crew scanning the sky ahead, never suspecting what was behind them. German night fighters depended heavily on ground radar warnings, and on this night, that warning never came. Ernst fired. The 4 20mm cannons erupted, sending a stream of high-explosive shells into the German aircraft. Pieces tore away from the fuselage. The left engine burst into flames, and the Bf-110 rolled violently, diving toward the cloud layer below. Ernst followed, firing short, controlled bursts as the German pilot fought to escape. The Bf-110 was agile and well-handled, but Ernst held the advantage in both position and firepower. At 3,000 feet, the enemy disappeared into the clouds. Ernst dove after him. The Black Widow plunged through the gray mass, Kopsel calling out altitude as they descended. They broke out beneath the cloud layer at 1,500 feet. The sky was empty. Kopsel searched with radar, sweeping the area. Nothing. The German aircraft had either crashed or escaped into terrain clutter. Without visual confirmation, the kill would be recorded as a probable. Ernst climbed again. The encounter had lasted less than 3 minutes. The night was far from over. At 1:50, Newtaus vectored them toward another contact. This one was different, slow-moving, barely 150 miles per hour. Likely a transport or a bomber flying conservatively to save fuel. Ernst approached from above. Kopsel guided him down, tightening the intercept until the shape emerged against the ground below. It was not a bomber. Single engine. Fixed landing gear. Inverted gull wings. A Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. An aircraft that had terrorized Europe in the early years of the war, now reduced to flying night missions to avoid Allied fighters. Not tonight. Ernst fired from 500 yards. The 20mm shells tore through the Stuka's fuselage, and the aircraft exploded almost instantly, suggesting it was carrying bombs. Burning wreckage spiraled downward, lighting the darkness below. Confirmed, Kopsel said. Time: 2:05. They had barely begun climbing again when another contact appeared. Same profile. Same speed. Another Stuka. The second German pilot must have seen his wingman destroyed. He dove immediately, trying to disappear into the terrain. Ernst followed without hesitation, pushing the aircraft down through 2,000 feet, then 1,500, then 1,000. The altimeter unwound rapidly. Kopsel never lost the contact. At 400 yards, the Stuka filled the windscreen. Ernst fired. The burst struck the engine, tearing it apart. The aircraft rolled onto its back and plunged directly into the ground, exploding on impact. 2:12. 2 confirmed kills in 7 minutes. Ernst pulled the Black Widow back up, climbing once more into the darkness. His hands ached from gripping the controls. His breathing was heavy, adrenaline still flooding through him. In 1 hour, they had engaged 3 targets. 1 probable, 2 confirmed. Combined with earlier victories, Ernst and Kopsel had just reached a milestone no American night fighter crew in Europe had achieved before. They were now aces, and they had done it together. Dawn was breaking over Belgium when borrowed time touched down at Florence. Ground crews gathered around the aircraft, counting fresh holes in the fuselage from earlier flak. Nothing serious. Damage that could be repaired within a day. The debrief lasted 3 hours. Every engagement was documented in detail. The Bf-110 was recorded as damaged, possibly destroyed. The 2 Ju-87s were confirmed based on observed explosions. Their total now stood at 5 confirmed kills, plus 1 V-1 flying bomb. 6 victories. Enough to place them at the top. But what made their achievement remarkable was not just the number. It was the consistency, the survival, and the ability to operate effectively in one of the most unforgiving forms of combat in the war. After the war, the statistics confirmed it. No American night fighter crew in the European theater surpassed their record. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron itself became the top-scoring American night fighter unit, with 43 confirmed kills against manned aircraft and 5 V-1s destroyed. The cost was high: crashes, mechanical failures, and crews who never returned. But the squadron proved that American pilots could master the darkness once dominated by the Luftwaffe. 3 crews achieved ace status within the unit. Ernst and Kopsel in borrowed time. Paul Smith and Robert Tierney in Lady Jane. Eugene Axtell and his radar operator in another Black Widow that carved its own place into history. Each crew developed its own rhythm, its own language, its own trust. But for Ernst and Kopsel, it came down to something simpler. They had been given time that should not have belonged to them, and they had used every second of it. What Ernst and Kopsel shared was not just experience, but the rare ability to function as a single, unified system in an environment that demanded absolute coordination. Night fighting left no margin for hesitation, no room for ego, and no space for doubt. It required 2 men to trust each other completely while operating in conditions where human senses alone were useless. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was beginning to collapse under its own weight. Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March, pushing deep into Germany as industrial centers crumbled under relentless bombing. The Luftwaffe, once dominant in the night sky, was running out of everything that mattered: fuel, aircraft, trained pilots, and time. Night missions changed. What had once been intense hunts through crowded skies became long, silent patrols over a dying enemy. The radar scopes that had once filled with contacts now showed little more than empty space and ground echoes. The sky that had demanded everything from Ernst and Kopsel simply stopped offering targets. They kept flying. Night after night, they climbed into borrowed time and patrolled the darkness, even as the war faded around them. But after the mission of March 1st and 2nd, they never added another victory to their record. There was nothing left to hunt. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war that had shaped their partnership ended as suddenly as it had intensified months before. The enemy they had learned to track, intercept, and destroy in total darkness simply ceased to exist. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron was inactivated in September 1945. The P-61 Black Widows, machines that had represented the cutting edge of wartime technology, were flown to depots, stripped of their classified radar systems, and dismantled. Within a few short years, almost nothing remained of the aircraft that had pioneered American night fighting. Ernst's life after the war followed a path different from many combat pilots. He stayed connected to aviation, continuing his service through the reserves while building a civilian career in sound and communications technology. The skills he had developed in combat, flying blind, trusting instruments, relying on systems he could not see, translated naturally into a technical world that depended on precision and invisible signals. Kopsel returned to civilian life as well. The partnership that had defined their war dissolved quietly into peacetime routines. Two men who had trusted each other completely in the darkness of combat went their separate ways, carrying with them experiences that few others could fully understand. But the name they had chosen for their aircraft remained. Borrowed time had never been just a joke or a superstition. It had been a statement. Both men had survived crashes that should have killed them. Both had walked away from events that ended the lives of others. They understood, perhaps more clearly than most, that the time they were living on was not guaranteed. They had taken that time and used it. Hermann Ernst lived for more than 6 decades after the war ended. He retired from the Tennessee Air National Guard as a lieutenant colonel, having spent far more years in uniform than he had in combat. His civilian career kept him connected to the same technical world that had defined his wartime service, and he remained active as a pilot long after most men his age had stepped away from flying. His achievements did not go unnoticed. The Gathering of Eagles Foundation later inducted him into its Hall of Honor, placing his name alongside some of the most accomplished aviators in history. The official citation listed the numbers: 5 aircraft destroyed, 1 V-1 flying bomb eliminated, A status, the highest-scoring American night fighter crew in Europe. But numbers alone could not explain what those missions had required. They could not describe the experience of flying blind through darkness at 300 miles per hour, trusting another man's voice to guide you toward an enemy you could not see. They could not capture the weight of that trust. Edward Kopsel's post-war life left fewer traces in official records, a reflection of a broader reality. Radar operators, despite sharing equal risk and requiring equal skill, rarely receive the same recognition as pilots. Yet every intercept, every engagement, every victory depended on the man watching the radar scope. Without Kopsel, Ernst would have been flying alone in darkness. Without Ernst, Kopsel's instructions would have meant nothing. Together, they formed something the Army Air Forces had struggled to perfect throughout the war, a form of combat teamwork unlike anything else. Not the formation discipline of bomber crews, and not the wingman tactics of daylight fighters, but something more intimate. 2 men, separated physically within the aircraft, connected only by intercom, trusting each other completely while hunting targets neither of them could fully see. The aircraft that made that partnership possible has nearly vanished from the world. Of the 742 P-61 Black Widows built, only a handful remain today. One is preserved in the National Air and Space Museum. Another resides in Beijing, captured and preserved after the war. A few more exist in various stages of restoration. Borrowed time is not among them. Like most combat aircraft, it was scrapped, reduced to raw materials that were repurposed into everyday objects, appliances, vehicles, fragments of a world that moved on. The name once painted on its nose survives only in photographs and official documents, a quiet record of something extraordinary. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron is remembered through a memorial at the United States Air Force Academy, honoring the men who pioneered American night combat in Europe. The unit itself was later reactivated in a new role, Its lineage carried forward by modern pilots flying aircraft far more advanced than anything Ernst could have imagined. But the foundation remains the same. What Ernst and Kopsel proved still matters. They showed that technology could extend human capability into environments where human senses failed. They proved that trust between two individuals could replace sight itself. And they demonstrated that survival, when it comes unexpectedly, can be transformed into something meaningful. The skies over Europe are quiet now. The airfields where they once flew serve new purposes. The war that demanded night fighters ended generations ago. But somewhere in archives and records, their story remains. Mission reports, radar logs, debriefing transcripts. A paper trail left behind by two men who flew into complete darkness and came back with victories that almost no one ever saw.